The wildfire started in a rural residential area with sparse woodland mixed with grasslands, very dry grasslands. This is an environment which is very conducive to fire. In fact, and historically, fires are very common in this environment, and doesn't. And in such dry, windy conditions, it doesn't take much to spark a fire and to send it into town, which is what it did.
Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. I'd like to welcome this week's guest, Andy Zahn. Andy Zahn is a freelance writer and photographer running for position 1 in Washington's 20th legislative district. Andy is a passionate advocate for bold action to uplift communities and protect the environment. His campaign platform is centered on rural revitalization measures such as creating new parks, investing in industrial hemp production, public transit, and fighting back against data centers, mega warehouses, and suburban sprawl. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast, Andy.
Thank you, Josh. I'm happy to be here. Good opportunity to get the word out here.
Yeah, well, you're definitely the person to do so. And like I was saying before, you've been in my periphery for a while. Our paths have crossed, I believe, in the past. Yet you came more solidly on the radar just the other week where you had a really interesting Facebook post. Yes, some people still use Facebook. Some of us use Facebook. And you were talking about the wildfire that burned through Spokane, Washington. Spokane? Sorry, I'm probably already saying that wrong. Spokane?
Spokane is fine, yeah.
I've taken the train through Spokane. That's what I know. So Spokane, and so there was a wildfire. And of course, the first thing that the disinformation agents in the clear-cut cult say is, if only we had logged everything more, that wouldn't have happened. So do you want to summarize what your post is, what your take is on that?
Yeah, happy to. So in the first place, the assertion that this is a forest fire really at all is very misleading. The wildfire started in a rural residential area with sparse woodland mixed with grasslands, very dry grasslands. This is an environment which is very conducive to fire. In fact, and historically, fires are very common in this environment, and doesn't. And in such dry, windy conditions, it doesn't take much to spark a fire and to send it into town, which is what it did. The fire moved rapidly into the suburban outskirts of Spokane, and really the characterization of it as a forest fire at all is deeply flawed. And a lot of the people posting about this uh, aren't familiar with the area. They really don't pay any attention to the actual characteristics of the fire itself. They just have this script they read off of that is honestly fed to them by the timber corporations and their to push that agenda and spread misinformation.
Yeah, that's a great summary of this. So I'm looking at the image there. So there's an image of the fire, and then there's something called Old Trails, and then there's something called the Little Spokane Natural Area. So can you describe, a little more of that area, a little more detail, just so people know exactly where that's been burning, and maybe even what the latest status is of all of that as of today?
For the status, I've kind of been keeping up with the fire maps of the area. It doesn't seem to be spreading much from what I've been able to tell from the fire maps and the news now. So I would assume that means that the winds have died down, and I don't think they're getting that same 40-mile-per-hour winds, which are what blew these fires up so big, because it was a combination of the heat, wind, and drought, which are the three key factors behind catastrophic fires. That is what really creates the conditions for a fire to go from just being sparked to flying across thousands of acres into residential areas in a matter of hours. So people like to use the use fuel as their only characteristic of how a fire spreads. They're so focused on fuel. But if you have moist, cool conditions and very little wind, a fire can start in an area of dense fuel, but not spread quickly. It's fairly easy to get under control, regardless of the density of the vegetation, or the dead matter, or organic debris. But when you start a fire in a hot, dry, windy environment, it's going to take off really almost regardless of the quantity of fuel available. Uh, even if you have previously cleared away a lot of the vegetation and the debris that are an ecosystem, and you've done that, that fire is still going to whip through and catch on anything that's growing there, any sort of flammable debris. A good example here would be like how well, he was able to cross the Spokane riverbed there, to jump across that. If we look at the little giant fire in the Cascade Mountains, it was able to jump across Lake Chelan. So people think that like fire breaks are a defense against fires, but when a fire really gets going, when in high winds, it can jump enormous distances without having any fuel in between. So fuel is really a minor part of the equation. And what also people don't realize is that the fuels that are removed, when you come in and you scrape out all the vegetation and stuff, that introduces invasive species. And frequently those invasive species are more flammable than what they replace. So maybe you reduce the fuel load in the forest for a year, maybe 2 years, but very quickly that's all going to come back with essentially invasive weeds, plants that are going to dry out in the summer and create the sort of conditions we saw in Spokane. So on the ground in Spokane, you can look at the way the fire spread through the dry grass, through these open areas of grassland and through the sparse forest there, because we're not talking about a thick forest here. This is a fairly open. It's not what people are imagining with a dense mountainous area. This is a not that. And once it got into the houses there in Spokane, in the subdivisions, that it just went from house to house through across streets. It's very difficult. It's pretty much impossible to contain a fire when it is in those sort of conditions. And last time I checked, all the fires in Spokane area were still sitting at 0% containment, which is, I don't quite understand that, since they aren't spreading significantly, and like the actual like maps of the fires are showing that it's dying. It's not very active right now. So I think that just means that mopping it up is a really difficult undertaking, especially across the size of the area that's been burned.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's a great overview. Thanks. I actually wasn't super familiar with all the details, so that's really helpful. And in the meantime, I was looking some information up. And by the way, today's Friday, August 7th. This podcast will be coming out on next Wednesday. So people who are listening, realize the time has passed slightly. But basically, one of the fires that started, so I guess there were a few that had started that destroyed, it says hundreds of buildings. The person who started, an arsonist, he said he planned it for weeks and had researched when the weather would be best for igniting it. So unfortunately, the only people who don't understand the reality of where, how, and why forest fires burn hot seems to be the Forest Service and the logging folks, because they're the ones who are like, oh, it should have been the fuels. Even this arsonist criminal, it's like, no, it's actually the weather and the wind. So everyone seems to understand this. And it's great that you get that. You're putting out the accurate science there as somebody who's running for political office, because right now, most elected officials either have no clue because they've been fed information by basically agency staffers, is what I've learned, or they're kind of looking to have a simple false solution to make it seem like they're doing something about wildfire. Don't worry, we destroyed all of your open space parks and national forests, so we're good. We're covering the wildfire angle. So yeah, I mean we could talk a little bit more about the Spokane stuff, but I also wanted to ask you about your take on how elected officials engage in this. But is there anything else you want to report on the Spokane fire?
Another okay, one aspect of it which I did want to mention, and I think I went over it in my post. I know I went over it in a couple of posts I've made over the this week. Is the how indefensible American cities are to fires. Our cities sprawl far out beyond the city center, and the larger a city is, the less defensible it is. You have like in this case, it the suburban sprawl goes way out into the forest, into the wilderness urban interface, and it means that firefight when trying to defend that, firefighters are having to cover a vast area to evacuate people from many square miles of land. And it gets even more difficult when when you go into rural areas where people live way out there in very dispersed communities. And it, if nothing else, even if you're in a situation where the conditions are so extreme that there's just nothing firefighters can do to stop that fire from moving, if a community is more densely packed and more in a smaller area, it's just a smaller target. If Spokane hadn't sprawled out as much as it did, then all of the fires we're talking that happened there, they wouldn't have imperiled anyone. The way this fire moved, it cut straight across the outskirts of Spokane there, like the edge of that sprawl. And I think there's a big argument to be made here that if we work to increase density and over time potentially contract the size of communities, we could greatly reduce the threat of wildfires, even as they become more severe as a consequence of climate change, and should work on making those communities more defensible to fire in how they are planned and laid out. Uh, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that we don't want to create these concrete wastelands. We remove like everything, like all the vegetation and stuff that makes these communities a livable space. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the factors which drive these fires, the heat, the wind, and the drought, are really they aren't going to be affected by because these factors play such a large role in catastrophic fires. If you don't really gain very much by stripping out trees and vegetation from cities. So I think that's something that's important to be aware of.
These are such great points, and I'm so glad you're focusing on this because, yeah, that seems to be the scientific consensus and just frankly logical common sense that let's say wildfire in this case, this is not a great analogy, but let's say wildfire is a disease. It's not wildfire is super important, but it is a threat when it comes to human communities. So we can go out there and trying to, let's say, kill everyone who has the disease in the world, which would be the equivalent of logging out in the forest or boosting the immunity of the communities. You can do, I'm not going to get into that. You can boost immunities in different ways. So whatever that may be, that's the idea of protecting a community. And what I've found is that elected officials, present company excluded, I'm sure, like to just, or those who are running for office, they like to mouth concern with community stuff. They're saying, yes, 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 home hardening. But then you find out that they're doing almost nothing but promoting logging. So we have a situation here in Colorado where we have basically all the elected officials, almost all of them, the agencies, even NGOs, they're just advocating for nonstop, endless logging. Tens of millions of dollars are going through basically every year. And then there was a bill that a state legislator put forward that we helped make happen that would have routed a percentage of wildfire mitigation that is almost exclusively going to logging towards actually grants for home hardening for low income, uh, elderly and people with disabilities in the fire plane. So this is not just randomly choosing people or here you're a rich person with a mansion, here's money. No, no, no. This is focused on people who are most at risk and can't afford doing that. These same elected officials that say, oh, it is important to harden homes, they all testified against it and they got the bill killed. So now we can point, oh, these people are just full of crap. They're not saying, oh, all of the above. No, all they want is logging because the logging funds their agencies. They're running out of money for everything else. So they basically, you say wildfire, say the F word, fire, and all of a sudden it's funding it. So I'm really psyched that you're looking at that. You're looking at it in terms of sprawl, which is super important. Something I'm curious if you have any thoughts on is so I'm living in a rural community. I live up in the mountains, 8,500 feet. My backyard is national forest. Meanwhile, right down the road, there's somebody who's building this 6,000 square foot mansion, pushing further into the fire plane. Now, granted, I live out here. This originally was a patch of forest, I assume. I'm renting. The house was here when I got here. But, it pushed further into it. It made it so this community that was created is going to be more vulnerable. It has additional costs for firefighting, et cetera, et cetera. But we're still pushing further and further and further into the fire plane, almost like we're building all of these homes in, it's a low tide, and then we're building it below the tide line, and then we're surprised when the tide comes. So what are your thoughts about rural areas and zoning or whatever?
Well, I too live in a rural area, a very rural area. The nearest bus stop to where I live is like 20 miles away. It's way out there, and I see it here too. Uh, sprawl pushing out the rural sprawl pushing out into the fields and forests here and into the fire plane and into floodplains too. They're like I remember when the county commissioners here in Cowles County lifted the moratorium on building on the Toutle River floodplain. The a floodplain which just back in 1980 was completely inundated by Mount St. Helens, and here we are having people building again on the floodplain. Now, up in Centralia, Washington, they want to build a whole bunch of mega warehouses on the floodplain directly next to the Chehalis River. And what that's going to do there is going to exacerbate flooding in an area that is already extremely prone to flooding. You're going to have it inundating people's houses in the community the next time it floods as a consequence of building these warehouses. So we really have to stop this sprawl into further out into rural areas of those important spaces because we really have a very limited those fields and those forests. They are limited to supply. Our agricultural areas on our wild areas are disappearing, but at the same time, we've got to prevent those places from sprawl from occurring in rural areas for the sake of the safety of those communities, the defensibility of those communities to catastrophic events, also the cost of the financial cost of that sprawl is much higher than people think, and it's not just cost to the people who build out there and live out there. It's cost to the state government to communities because uh, sprawl sprawling rural areas uh, actually are a financial drain on urban areas, on larger state governments. They have to be subsidized. And that's a larger, like here in Washington, that's a large part of our ongoing and chronic budget problems, is that we are having to subsidize rural areas of the state which are not self-sustainable economically. And that is in large part due to the financial weight of the sprawl and that financial hole is widening, the more we allow sprawl to occur. So it's a very there's a lot of reasons why we have to control suburban sprawl and just sprawl out into rural areas in general. And that doesn't have to become at the cost of housing either, because the place where we should be locating housing is in the central areas of communities, where it is defensible, it has access to transportation, and it contributes positively to making these communities financially sustainable, self-sustaining. The more you concentrate, the more you make communities more dense, the more financially sustainable they are, and the more we work towards solving state and, on a larger scale, federal budgetary issues. So I would say that we need to halt sprawl entirely.
Yeah, well, that's great that you're tackling this. Why would you say most elected officials are not interested in addressing that?
It's a tough issue. It's a authority issue. It's one that's um, it gets a lot of pushback from especially from developers, real estate agents, and which there's a lot of politicians who are developers and real estate um, agents. So you have definitely a conflict of interest there, and it is a it also means that you can look people look at it as like, oh, if you're going to stop development out there, you're not going to be making extra money from taxes from these properties, not realizing that the more you allow sprawl to occur, the more you actually drain public resources. So I think there's elements of self-interest, a disinclination to address a very difficult issue, and just a lack of understanding of the of this multifaceted issue.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that. And what's your district like in terms of land and land use and stuff like that?
It has an extremely dispersed population. It's about as rural as you can get in Western Washington. As that fact takes all the uh, most dispersed areas of Clark, the Thurston, Lewis, and Cowlitz counties and combines them all into a whole. It's an enormous area, and the distances between towns can be considerable, and the distances between people here can be considerable. So the and it's also an area which is being increasingly affected by sprawl and the negative consequences of that as it pushes out into these areas. It seems like every year another farm gets paved over, another forest gets paved over, and the few remaining habitat corridors between the Cascades and the Olympics get increasingly fragmented, and it's a real concern here. The um, and it's an area where also people are difficult to reach. It's difficult to get a message out to a lot of people in the 20th legislative district just because people are so dispersed. We've got also have issues with internet connectivity here because of how remote everywhere is. So a lot of people just don't have a lot of access to communication, the sort of communications that uh, um, we that people in more urban areas have to, and or the kind of close-knit community, more um, access to more of a community resources and education. So there's a lot of factors at play.
Cool, really interesting. Yeah, I lived in Oregon for several years and I didn't get up to Washington as much as I would have liked, but I have to say some of the most beautiful landscapes I've seen have been in Washington, Olympic National Park, the Hoh Rainforest, the San Juan Islands, and the coast of Washington is actually my favorite coast because it just felt really the parts that I stopped in just felt like really undeveloped and sort of just remote and pristine. But I also saw some of the worst private lands logging I've ever seen was driving through Washington as well. So what's the deal with the timber industry and do you think they're gonna come after you, at least
Well,
fight you.
considering how much the t timber industry has donated to my opponent, I would say they are very much coming after me, and that's largely because that they don't want to implement the necessary reforms to make that industry sustainable and viable for the long term. Like you said, Washington has absolutely terrible forest practices here. We have enormous clear cuts that are then sprayed with herbicide. They're like here in the Toutle River Basin where I live, the Department of Natural Resources recently sprayed thousands of acres with herbicides, which have enormous impacts both on communities and watersheds and forest ecosystems. And then they replant them with a low diversity plantations, which don't have the same benefits as a natural forest, and they only let them grow for 30 to 40 years. So you also don't get the benefits of an older forest. And it's very much causing self-harm to the industry itself because the more these practices are implemented, the longer they're implemented, the more it degrades forest lands, the more it degrades the health of these forests and puts them at risk of fires and disease and infestation. And it there uh, Eventually it will likely lead to a large-scale collapse of the timber industry itself, and they don't care about that because what they are interested in is maintaining quarterly profits for shareholders. It's not about sustainable forestry. It's not about managing the forest even for long-term timber production. It's about extracting as much money for as they possibly can each quarter, without regard to the impact that will have on the environment or on communities. Uh, and it's not, and the reforms we need would not destroy timber jobs. It would mean a reduction in the output, at least temporarily, until you establish a sustainable long-term harvest cycle. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that tree growth is exponential. It's not linear. A lot of people think that a young forest grows faster than an old forest, but that it's in fact the opposite is true. An older forest is growing faster than a younger forest. So when you cut a forest at 30 to 40 years old, you're missing out on the best levels of growth there, more carbon capture, and more timber being added to the bulk of those trees. And so you end up with a much, much lower timber output per tree when you do these short harvest cycles. There's a when it comes to diversity too, the industry is only focused mostly just on cultivating Doug firs here. So you they there's all these other different kinds of trees that go into making a healthy forest ecosystem, and those trees, like from a financial point of view, can be useful for different materials than what you just produced with Doug fir. So it needs to become a um, uh, more diverse and thoughtful industry. Um, and I believe that wood products need to become um, more of a high-end product. They need to be sold at higher prices, and we need to find alternative products for a lot of the uses we have for them right now, like as such as for paper and a lot of the low-end wood products they need to be replaced with industrial hemp, which is actually when turned into hemp wood, is 20% stronger than hickory. You can make pretty much any wood product out of it. You can make plastics out of it. There's cloth, rope, etc. There's a lot you can make out of hemp. It grows 4 times faster than trees. You can grow it on the same land as existing crops using rotation and intercrop planting. So you have that alter. You can And part of the advantage of that is it creates even more jobs. If you were to switch over that at a large scale, create even more jobs and economic opportunity than currently exists within the timber industry. And you would still keep the timber industry as a more like way of producing high-end products, high-end forest products using that, and it would still retain a large number of the jobs. What people have to realize right now with these uh, large corporations and their focus on shareholder profits, very little of that actual profit from these corporations trickles down to the actual workers on the ground, to the industry itself. So if you transition to a higher end industry for wood products, you can maintain likely a similar level of jobs as currently exist in that industry while making it genuinely sustainable as opposed to now where it is very not much not sustainable, and at the same time create a plethora of new jobs in the industrial hemp industry. And it's worth noting that that also makes other industries more sustainable. Like cotton isn't a very sustainable thing to grow, and that can be replaced with hemp. We can largely eliminate the use of petrochemicals by using hemp-based plastics instead. So there's enormous advantages to that, to both forest practices reforms and uh, replacing that output of forest products with hemp products. And I feel like I know I've been talking for a long time here, but I want to go into how this kind of relates back to uh, protecting our communities from fires, because an older natural forest, is a diverse forest, is um, these forests provide ecosystem services which reduce fire danger. They reduce heat, drought, and wind speed on both a local and regional level, meaning that you're affecting those key factors that contribute to catastrophic fires such as occurred in Spokane. Now, I'm not saying that this would have directly had an impact on Spokane itself, because that is out in a very dry, arid region of grassland and stuff. But even in a grassland region, a natural native ecosystem is still going to be cooler, more moist, and less windy potentially. So these ecosystem benefits are really important to keep in mind. And when people look at a large fire out in the forest, out in the Cascades, they have to realize that the conditions out there are being affected by the poor forest practices on private land. When you have large areas of the state which have been stripped bare of trees, or are subjected to all these various harmful forest practices, that extends to lands out on a regional scale to federal lands, to state lands, to parks, and to our communities. If we had if we had already implemented better forest practices, the temperatures, the drought, and the wind speeds we're experiencing now would be significantly less extreme than what we are experiencing, and that extends to flooding, to landslides. There is just it and to the health of salmon runs. This is all like forest practices have a significant impact on salmon runs. There's so many interconnected facets to this, and I think people don't have a hard time realizing just how interconnected all these systems are, and that simply saying log it or watch it burn is the phrase they like to use. That is the opposite of what's true. And the people need to realize that the politicians and the pundits who push that messaging are in the pocket of the timber industry. One example of this would be in the 19th district here in Washington. Jim Walsh, during the whole time these fires were going on in Spokane, he was posting about how that's this is all these are this is all for the not because of they're not logging stuff. That would have boils down to what he was messaging that, and he's taking money from the timber industry. He has big donations from the timber industry to his campaign, and it's just uh, people need to realize that the source of the information of the propaganda that's pushing the log it or let it burn message is the timber industry. That is who is pushing that, and the truth is the exact opposite of that messaging.
Absolutely. No, really well said. And it's great how well versed you are in these topics. I think most elected officials really are not. And like saying before, they just take the word from, well, of course, they're corporate industry donors, obviously, but even the ones who are a little more good faith, they just listen to the agency staffers who are trained by industrial forestry techniques. So it's the same sort
Such
of
as
thing.
such as the School of Forestry and Environmental Science at the University of Washington, which is heavily funded by the timber industry. That is very closely linked to that.
Of
So,
course.
and when you get so, of course, when people come out are educated for that like that and go into on to become experts with, say, the Washington Department of Natural Resources, then the politicians listen to them and they are essentially listening to the timber industry through them.
Yeah, well, that's the same thing with Oregon State University. It's a big timber school. Of course, there could be some good folks who go through there, some
Oh,
good
oh,
programs,
absolutely.
but by and large, that's the mentality. Same with here in Colorado, Colorado State University. Some great professors there, some great students, and some great programs, but it's also housing, all of these entities like the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, which is really about promoting logging in the name of wildfire. So that's the mentality. And yeah, I think it's important to point out to people that less than 4% of timber comes from public lands. So the idea that we need any public lands logging is, I think, an absurd notion. And that's not to say, okay, just, put it all on the private timberlands. I think, first of all, your idea of like, well, we should be using a lot less wood products through these other alternatives. I think that's spot on. But even the private timberlands, whatever, whether they're corporate or small or private, they can be doing better versions of it. So they can create better models. So it's not all this clear cut liquidate herbicide model. And that really is a more sustainable over term. It's better for jobs. But what's ironic is what I learned living out in the Pacific Northwest is that while the logging industry talks all day long about jobs, they hate jobs. Like they want one guy and a feller buncher out there. They want to cut costs as much as possible. So
Mhm.
that's
Exactly.
been my angle on that.
And shipping logs overseas to be processed elsewhere, like man, they will cut jobs as much as humanly possible to increase shareholder profits.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, the log it, graze it, or watch it burn stuff, I would get those comments on our social media. I was like, it seems like a bumper sticker. And I was like, oh, it is a bumper sticker. I mean, that's
Mhm.
the mentality. And I was talking with some folks, we need to do a version of that. And I was saying something like, save it, protect it, and, watch it thrive. And they're like, well, that's not clear enough. And one of the suggestions was log it, graze it, and watch it burn faster. Which I was like, that's not bad. So maybe we can make up some stickers for that. But we're getting towards the end here, but I got a couple more questions before our last question. But I just want to mention it here. I was looking up. Folks do support what Andy's doing, and man, I wish I lived somewhere where somebody like Andy was running for office, so I can actually, stomach up like voting for an actual person because I just see these candidates. I'm just like I can't vote for any of these candidates. They're all garbage. But so it's Andy Zahn, ANDYZAHN.com. You can contribute to his campaign. And if there's any competitors of Andy who want to come on the Green Root podcast and talk about this, we're open to equal time. You're welcome to come out here and talk logging industry stuff, but know that I'm going to refute anything which I believe is inaccurate, whereas Andy has a great knowledge of the science, so there's nothing for me to refute. But what I wanted to ask you was a couple things about, so your mention of wanting to do more parks. because that
Hmm.
is this strange juxtaposition that at least we're dealing with in Colorado is people are like, all right, well, we want to have denser housing, so the wildfire risk for sure, the less footprint, and also in terms of affordability, but we have these beautiful open space that I mean, I want people to be able to live affordable. I would like to myself. I found this place up here at a good price, luckily. I want people to be able to, be in walkable communities, but not at the expense of destroying open land. So how is that possible to do both of those things?
So I believe that parks in rural areas and in general are essential to the economy of these areas. Um, here in Washington, in the 20th district in particular, and actually throughout the rural area of the state, communities are located far away from the national parks, from the national forests. Like most communities are a considerable distance away. I mean, I live out in the rural areas here in the foothills of the Cascades. But for me to get to Mount Rainier National Park is a 2.5 hour drive. And that's the same for a lot of communities. Like and when those communities are located so far from parks and public lands, one of the consequences of that is that they become places that people just drive through. And so we have a $22.5 billion per year outdoor recreation industry here in Washington. It's enormous. But rural communities don't see really hardly any of that at all, because people have no reason to make rural communities their destinations. And my rural parks idea here is to create new parks in close proximity to these communities, and parks that people will want to travel to for outdoor recreation and tourism. They need to be large parks. We're talking about around 1,000 acres or more each. So large parks, and then you have a network of hiking, horseback riding, mountain biking trails out there. I've heard people want disc golf. I have no reason. No, that makes sense. You could have disc golf in there. But the point is that you make these large parks. Make them so that they are very low maintenance. They're very rustic, but they offer the opportunities that people who are going to national parks and national forests have these parks near rural communities offer those activities, offer the significant hiking options that people who are going out for a day hike are looking for, or even for a backpacking trip. And you have those located as close as possible to the community center in the best possible location nearby. And most rural communities have such location. I have gone through and identified 34 different parks in the 20th legislative district, that potential parks, which could offer these advantages for the communities there. And then once you have that in place, then people have a reason to go to these parks instead of out somewhere much farther away. And part of this involves restoration. I mean, of course, we're talking about mostly heavily logged plantation forests, the clear cuts and things. So it's essentially a blank slate for creating a really appealing outdoor area. One thing in Washington to be aware of is that we have native prairies in Western Washington, and they are an extremely endangered ecosystem. Barely any of this terrain remains. And what I would like to see is a lot of clear cuts restored as native prairie. And if you do that strategically, then you make some really compelling destinations that are amazing in the spring, summer, and fall. And you bring in those native hardwoods that have been extirpated from a lot of the state, and you replant those strategically as well. And you very quickly create outdoor recreation areas that are every bit as appealing as those way out farther in the forest. You draw in the people who would otherwise be going out there. You reduce the overcrowding at Mount Rainier National Park, in Olympic National Park, and in the national forests and in the state parks. You reduce the crowding there. You solve that problem essentially, while also bringing in those outdoor recreation and tourism dollars into small communities. And when you do it on a large enough scale, you make enough of these parks and enough communities, then those communities become regional destinations where somebody can go and stay in one town, and then they've got hotspot Broadway, that one town to visit, but then the next town over has another park. They offer something different, and you can have people making their whole vacations be these areas of these rural areas, these rural communities, which really need that kind of uh, uh, economy. And I think it doesn't there this doesn't come at a cost to housing either, because the place for housing, as we've already discussed, is in the communities themselves, in the central area of those communities, where they're near to public transit, where they're near to amenities, where having more people living in uh, uh, dense, affordable housing in these communities will contribute positively to the economy there. You have if you have people living in affordable housing with access to public transit and also to affordable health care, but we won't go into that. Uh, if you reduce their expenses significantly, so even people on a low income have much more money to spend, and they're going to spend it at businesses in these communities, and it all works together for an immense amount of economic uplift in the most disadvantaged rural communities.
I think that's a beautiful plan. Yeah, that sounds really excellent and makes total sense to me. So thanks for that. So yeah, the last question I like to ask guests on the Green Root podcast is, what do you feel like is a root cause of the ecological crisis? So what do you think, Andy?
Well, the very simple answer would be greed and ignorance. But it is a very complicated thing. It boils down to the way our society and culture is structured. Um, Especially in America, we have a growth-based uh, um, economic system that is where people are always believe that we have to keep growing exponentially, constantly, in order to maintain our quality of life and all the comforts that they enjoy in their lives. They're maintaining their way of life, and that's just not true. We can have a uh, a um, a sustainable economy that doesn't rely on growth, a steady state economy. That is what we should be aiming for. And I believe that it is our economic and cultural foundation that needs to change, that is the root of the ecological crisis.
That's a beautiful answer. Yeah, glad you brought up steady state economy. Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for all you're doing. Your campaign sounds really interesting. People can check it out at andyzahn.com and get in touch with Andy, I assume. And if you live in Washington, well, here's an opportunity to vote in somebody who gets these issues and seems willing to stick their neck out to actually create, seems like, positive change. So thanks, Andy.
Well, thanks for having me on, Josh. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here and be able to talk about all of my ideas and the issues here in rural Washington and really throughout the nation.
Awesome. Thank you.